Jonathan had always believed his future was already written. He would inherit his father's empire, marry someone from an equally powerful family, and maintain the wealth that had sheltered him his entire life. But one sweltering afternoon, everything changed the moment he locked eyes with a young woman standing in a humble marketplace stall. She was counting her meager earnings, her gaze filled with a quiet resilience he'd never seen in the polished circles he knew. In that instant, he felt a spark that his fortune could never replicate. He sensed that Emily's world was different, far from the chauffeured cars and crystal chandeliers of his mansion. But something in her kind smile made him pause. He never imagined he would risk an entire legacy just to be near someone who spent each day struggling to earn a few coins. Yet, beneath the scorching sun and the frenetic noises of the bazaar, Jonathan realized that this one meeting could upend every comfort had taken for granted. He couldn't guess how violently his father would oppose this connection, or how shocking his family's reaction would be, but the first time he saw Emily, he knew he would never be the same. He was in the back seat of the family sedan when he spotted her, his father's stern voice echoing about an upcoming gala. They inched through congested traffic, and Jonathan's gaze drifted toward the sidewalk. Vendors shouted over each other to sell fruit and spices, while Emily helped an older man gather scattered apples from the dusty ground. There was no reason for Jonathan to linger. His father's schedule was packed with power lunches and business deals, but the gentle sincerity in Emily's eyes as she handed the old man his fruit back lingered in Jonathan's mind longer than he expected. When the car finally lurched forward, Jonathan glanced over his shoulder, watching Emily fade into the crowd. He tried to refocus on his father's words about business mergers and a potential arrangement with the wealthy Barrafield family, but his thoughts kept drifting, recalling Emily's worn dress and the quiet determination on her face. Back at the estate, he was supposed to review documents about a philanthropic venture that would enhance his father's public image. Instead, he found himself staring out the window, picturing the bustling market and the girl who labored under the harsh sun. That evening, the grand gala commenced with all the usual ostentation. Chandeliers sparkled above polished floors, and a catered orchestra provided elegant background music. Jonathan arrived in a tailored suit that fit him like armor, aware that his presence was expected more than welcomed. His mother fluttered around the guests, dropping polite remarks. His father was busy impressing foreign investors. Everyone assumed Jonathan would take over the family empire when the time came, stepping into a role he had never chosen for himself. Clarissa Barrafield appeared at his elbow, poised, polite, well-versed in superficial pleasantries. She laughed daintily at his remarks, though her eyes revealed an indifference that matched his own. Yet all through the night, Jonathan's mind kept flashing back to the marketplace. He pictured the street vendors and Emily's kindness to that elderly man. He forced himself to smile at Clarissa's conversation about luxurious getaways and glittering galas. Her every sentence reminded him of the life he had always known. Predictable, comfortable, and hollow. An inexplicable longing tugged at his chest, and that final image of Emily's gentle resolve refused to fade. The next day, Jonathan felt compelled to return to the bazaar. He told the chauffeur he needed a different route, ignoring the driver's puzzled expression. Once there, he walked alone between stalls where the scents of spices, fresh bread, and sweat filled the air. Customers haggled in loud voices, stray animals weaved around piles of produce, and the sun bore down mercilessly. Jonathan's loafers kicked up dust, a stark contrast to the polished marble floors he was used to. Eventually, he spotted Emily again, sorting a crate of vegetables with the same practiced focus he'd seen before. She noticed him and tilted her head in guarded curiosity. Her face was lightly smudged from work, strands of dark hair escaping her low ponytail. She recognized him from the day before, the man in the sleek sedan who watched her with an expression she couldn't decipher. When he introduced himself as Jonathan, she simply said, "Emily," before the clamor of the market interrupted them. A brief exchange followed. He tried to sound casual, but she seemed uncertain why someone from his world had ventured so far out of his comfort zone. Despite the awkwardness, Jonathan returned the next day, and the next day. Little by little, he learned pieces of Emily's life. She worked tirelessly at the stall to support her mother and brother, Adams. Money was always tight, and any misstep could mean going hungry. Yet she carried herself with an integrity that made Jonathan ache with admiration. In return, he hesitantly shared, that he was under immense pressure to marry a woman he barely knew, all to satisfy his father's ambition. He chose his words carefully, never admitting the true scale of his family's wealth. Sensing Emily's world might find it obscene, she never said much about her daily struggles, but the fatigue in her eyes told him enough. Each conversation they managed felt oddly significant, snatches of honesty that Jonathan had rarely encountered in his opulent circle. Sometimes he would catch Emily smiling at small victories, like selling out all her produce by midday, and wonder if he'd ever been half as happy achieving something in his life. His father, however, had no idea about these clandestine trips to the bazaar. The old man's focus was on the upcoming merger and ensuring Jonathan appeared at the right events with Clarissa by his side. Jonathan's mother, with her impeccable manners, never pried but sensed a shift in her son's behavior. Late one evening, she approached him in the mansion's grand foyer, her voice tinged with subtle concern. "You've been disappearing a lot lately," she said, eyeing his dusty shoes. Jonathan just nodded, muttering something about clearing his head. His mother didn't push. In their home, direct confrontation was rare and typically reserved for matters of business. Jonathan's only real confidant was a friend named Alex, a lawyer who had witnessed some of the family's business dealings from the sidelines. Over modest drinks one night, Jonathan admitted he had met someone who wasn't part of his world. Alex studied Jonathan's features, picking up on a deeper intensity than usual. "Be careful," Alex warned. "If your father sees her as a threat to his plans, he won't take it lightly." Jonathan knew this, but every time he imagined not visiting Emily's stall, his heart sank. Her quiet dignity seemed to fill a void he never realized he had. Soon enough, Adam, Emily's older brother, noticed Jonathan's frequent appearances. Tall and wary, Adam confronted him one afternoon, his tone sharp. "What do you really want here? People like you don't just wander in for a chat." Though Jonathan felt stung, he couldn't entirely blame Adam's distrust. It made sense that the brother would protect Emily from the kind of empty promises so often made by outsiders. Still, Jonathan's determination to break through that wall only grew stronger. He'd wake before dawn sometimes, telling himself it was just to see if the market needed volunteers. But in truth, it was to glimpse Emily's face at sunrise, to exchange a few words with her before the day's chaos set in. Inevitably, everything came to a head at a lavish party Jonathan's father hosted to celebrate a major business milestone. The estate gleamed with extravagance, tuxedoed waiters, ornate decorations, and an orchestra playing near marble columns. Jonathan drifted among the guests, feeling more disconnected from this life than ever. Suddenly, a hush rippled through the crowd. Emily appeared at the threshold, accompanied by Adam, both dressed simply, both looking utterly out of place among the glitter. Jonathan's heart lurched. He had no idea they planned to come here, and from the shocked stares neither did anyone else. Murmurs coursed through the ballroom. Jonathan's mother blanched at the sight. His father, upon realizing who these newcomers were, stormed across the polished floor. "Who allowed you inside?" he demanded. Emily lifted her chin, refusing to cower beneath his withering glare. Adam, equally unafraid, pointedly challenged the ethics of how Jonathan's family had amassed so much wealth. Tension crackled in the air. Jonathan's father lunged to call security, but Jonathan intervened, in a trembling voice loud enough for the nearest guests to hear. He declared that Emily wasn't just some intruder. She was someone he cared about. The crowd grew silent. His parents looked aghast. Clarissa, too, stared from the side, her expression one of cold disbelief. Guests began whispering, hungry for scandal. Anger flared in Jonathan's father. He railed against Emily, calling her a distraction, an opportunist. Emily stood firm, her eyes shiny with tears but never blinking away. Adam pressed his fists at his sides, on the verge of a furious outburst. Jonathan realized in that moment he couldn't keep pretending to straddle both worlds. He chose to side with Emily, his voice trembling as he declared he would walk away from a life built on exploitation if it meant preserving his self-respect and the chance at genuine love. The aftermath felt like a whirlwind. The party all but collapsed into heated arguments. Security eventually escorted Emily and Adam out, and Jonathan followed, ignoring his father's demands that he come back and make things right. Outside, in the cool night air, Emily's composure finally cracked. She told Jonathan that Adam had heard rumors. The family empire he stood to inherit was behind displacing entire communities, including some near the market. Though Jonathan had heard whispers of unethical deals, he had never paid close attention. Until now. Back at the mansion, Jonathan faced the full weight of his father's wrath. His mother begged him to reconsider, to apologize for the spectacle, but Jonathan refused. The next morning, a meeting was arranged in the estate's study, a place lined with rare books and trophies that showcased generations of power. His father stood behind the massive desk, gaze cold as steel. "If you continue this reckless association, you'll be cut off," he warned, voice eerily calm. Jonathan clenched his fists, feeling a sick dread, but also an unshakable determination. For the first time in his life, he wasn't willing to bow to his father's will. He left the estate with a few belongings stuffed into a duffel bag, unsure of where else to go. In the evening, he found himself at the entrance to Emily's modest home, which she shared with Adam and their ailing mother. Adam nearly slammed the door in his face, but paused when Emily intervened. Jonathan explained that he was done living a lie. Though his confession softened Emily's gaze, Adam remained guarded, reminding them that Jonathan's father was an enemy to their entire community. Jonathan could only promise that he wanted to do better, even if that meant forfeiting every material comfort he'd ever known. Sleeping on a worn couch in a cramped living room was a stark contrast to Jonathan's old life of spacious suites. He barely rested that first night, mind racing with questions about how he would support himself without his father's fortune. The next day, Emily helped him find temporary work, unloading produce crates before dawn. It was grueling labor, and his muscles, once more accustomed to golf swings than heavy lifting, protested. But every evening, he returned to the small home with a sense of fulfillment he'd never felt in the mansion. As time passed, Jonathan began learning the true extent of his father's unethical practices. The family's fortune was linked to numerous forced evictions, shady land deals, and bribes. Adam introduced him to locals who had lost everything when corporate development projects steamrolled their neighborhoods. Jonathan felt a mixture of shame and anger. He remembered the quiet guilt that had begun gnawing at him the moment he spotted Emily in that marketplace. Now it reached a full roar, fueling a desire to expose the corruption. He reached out to Alex, who had already suspected the empire's wrongdoing from a legal standpoint. Together, they compiled evidence, testimonies, financial documents, and hidden clauses. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that Jonathan's father was at the heart of these exploitative deals. Jonathan wrestled with how to reconcile a lifetime of parental love, or what he had thought was love, with the cruelty he now saw in his father's actions. In the meantime, his relationship with Emily blossomed. Away from the glitz and pretense, they fell into simple routines, sharing meals from her modest earnings, talking late into the night about hopes and fears. Their bond was tested constantly by financial hardship, social prejudice, and media whispers about the millionaire's son who ran off with a beggar's daughter. But each obstacle only confirmed that Jonathan would rather struggle beside Emily than Jonathan would rather struggle beside Emily, drown in his father's wealth. Eventually, leaked stories about corporate greed turned into full-blown investigations. Jonathan and Alex provided enough ammunition to journalists and local authorities that the empire's reputation plummeted. Protests erupted near the company's headquarters. Investors fled, and board members distanced themselves from Jonathan's father. The older man fought back, branding Jonathan as a traitor driven by romantic folly. Publicly, he denied all wrongdoing, but the evidence spoke for itself. Jonathan often found himself comforting Emily, who was weary of the paparazzi occasionally stalking their neighborhood. Adam, though never fully warm, showed grudging respect for Jonathan's willingness to stand against his own father. Amid the chaos, Jonathan's mother reached out quietly. Torn between loyalty to her husband and heartbreak over losing her son, she acknowledged that she had known of certain ethical gray areas, but never suspected the depth of the wrongdoing. Jonathan, though hurt, managed to comfort her. He still loved her, but he couldn't shield her from the consequences of their family's choices. Over time, Jonathan's father was forced to relinquish control of the empire. Lawsuits piled up, indictments loomed, and the board ousted him. Once glorified name now carried associations of corporate corruption and destroyed livelihoods. Jonathan watched everything unravel with a hollow ache. This was his heritage, and yet it had to fall for justice to be served. In contrast, his bond with Emily strengthened. He found legitimate, honest ways to support them, continuing his manual job and volunteering in community projects. With Alex's help, they directed some of the seized company assets toward rebuilding the very neighborhoods once threatened by the empire's expansion. Jonathan's mother, freed from her husband's overbearing influence, began to visit discreetly, offering quiet apologies to Emily and her family. She brought small gifts, simple tokens, like fresh groceries or medicine for Emily's ailing mother, no longer flaunting jewels or wearing the haughty air she once had. One late afternoon, while tidying the living room of Emily's home, Jonathan paused to reflect on how drastically his life had changed. Months ago, he never imagined he'd be content in a space smaller than his old bedroom. He opened the front door to find Emily just outside, sitting on the stoop, eyes closed, enjoying a rare moment of peace. He sat beside her, lacing his fingers through hers. Neither spoke, but the warmth of her hand confirmed he was exactly where he needed to be. Days later, Jonathan confessed that the time had come to take another step forward. He'd saved a little money, though hardly enough for grand gestures. It was enough to buy a simple ring. Mustering all the courage he had, he knelt before Emily in their modest kitchen, proposing to her with a quiet plea. Tears brimmed in her eyes as she said yes, her voice trembling with joy. The news of their engagement spread fast through the tight-knit neighborhood. Local friends celebrated with potluck dishes, turning their small apartment into a makeshift party space. Adam struggled to mask his own emotions, but even he offered a rough embrace to Jonathan, acknowledging that maybe love did have the power to bridge the unlikeliest of worlds. Jonathan's mother arrived with homemade decorations, tears in her eyes, as she helped Emily adjust the second-hand wedding dress. It was a humble garment, borrowed from a neighbor and altered to fit Emily's frame. For a moment, Jonathan's mother looked as if she might apologize again for everything. Instead, she simply said, "You two deserve real happiness," her gaze flicking from Emily's radiant face to Jonathan's grateful smile. They married in a small community hall, decorated with paper flowers and strings of lights. Neighbors, volunteers, and a handful of Jonathan's old school friends gathered to witness the union. Alex stood by Jonathan's side, proud and a little emotional. Emily's mother beamed through tears from her wheelchair, and Adam wore an uncharacteristically bright grin. The ceremony was simple but filled with genuine vows, promises of loyalty and understanding forged through adversity. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Jonathan kissed Emily amid applause that reverberated through the humble space. He felt light, as if shedding the last burden of his old life, stepping fully into a new chapter defined by honesty, empathy, and love. The man who once accepted a legacy of wealth without question now believed that true richness lay in the bonds we form and the integrity we live by. Afterward, everyone shared a modest feast of homemade dishes, and Jonathan's mother offered a tender toast, her voice trembling with pride. Adam cracked jokes that made Emily laugh, while neighbors recounted how improbable this wedding once seemed. A millionaire's son and a beggar's daughter. But as Jonathan and Emily gazed at each other, they saw how far they had come. They had faced rejection, scorn, and the unraveling of an empire, yet none of it destroyed the quiet power of their bond. Later that evening, once guests had gone, they returned to the small apartment. Emily rested her head on Jonathan's shoulder, and the hush of night enveloped them in a sense of promise. He thought about every obstacle, every tear shed, and the rush of relief when he finally chose to follow his heart. Leaning down, he whispered, "Thank you for believing in us." Emily smiled, eyes shining in the dim light. "You showed me that even in the darkest places, hope can grow." And so they began their life together, not in a gilded mansion, but in a simple home built on understanding and compassion. In that choice, Jonathan discovered a deeper purpose than any trust fund or lavish ball could provide. Where he once saw only obligations and a future laid out without his consent, he now felt the thrill of forging his own path, hand in hand with the woman who taught him that love's true power was measured not by status or wealth, but by the unwavering courage to stand together against all odds.